British identity is being attacked, without doubt.
By who?
If to the extent, by the way, if there's any racism in this country, I think the racism is
You can't deny that there's no racism
against
in this
white people. The problem for me with the EU was this ever closer union. What Ursula von der Leyen, who's president of the Commission, often describes as pooled sovereignty. And for me, that was a bridge too far in our cooperation with this trade bloc. And so pooled sovereignty for me is like the beginning of the end of nation states. And, you can't really empower Brussels unless you equally take away powers from individual states in order to hand them over to Brussels. And so for Brussels to be making laws and to be passing regulations in particular rather than directives, which at least national assemblies have an opportunity to interpret, for Brussels to be doing that, they have to diminish the importance of nation states. You can't strip power away without simultaneously diminishing the importance of the institution from which you're stripping power, which in this case is nation states. And what better way to do that than to dilute the identity of nation states through, and we see this quite a lot in the EU, through the clever use of language, through undermining national identities. For example, in this country, in the UK, and by the way, even though we've left the EU, I think there's still a propensity in the UK to sidle up with supranational institutions because we get some kind of comfort on the global stage. What better way to do that than to attack our heritage, attack our values, diminish what it is we were brought up to believe in, so that we cease to identify as Britons and start identifying as Europeans. If nation states cease to exist, then nationalities cease to exist, and where you're from becomes irrelevant. And immigration, unbridled immigration, if you like, becomes something that can't and shouldn't be resisted because you've given up your national identity. We're all now citizens of the world in this new utopian, hypothetical scenario that I've painted that I think the EU would like to drive towards. But when you look at what's happened in France, you can actually see how that has played out for France as a member of the EU. They've had very significant immigration over the last 15, 20 years. And immigration, by the way, I think is a good thing. Over time, if it's done sensibly, you get values evolve for the betterment of all those that are part of it. But when you do it too rapidly, as I think we've seen in France and we're at risk of in the United Kingdom, you get schisms in society. You get multiculturalism operating in silos rather than people coming together for the benefit of mutual sort of learning and the advancement of our value systems collectively. And we saw that in spades in France over the last couple of weeks, where we've got kind of ethnic-based violence that we haven't ever seen in Europe before.
Ethnic-based violence.
Yeah, well, I think it was basically North African ethnicities kicking off against the French authorities on the. It was that very unfortunate, awful shooting of that young.
I think you mean French people against French authorities.
Yeah, but they're of North African ethnicity, aren't they? They don't identify themselves as white.
We just spoke about national identity and the importance of national identity. I think the important thing to note about France is this. What we're seeing now is not the result of a sudden surge in immigration, or even because we're seeing lots of black and brown faces that are protesting, as well as white French citizens, that suddenly this is an immigration issue. We've seen this kind of sort of unrest and pain in France for decades. In 2005, we saw some of the biggest.
French are great for rioting.
I think there is a serious issue, as sort of exists in the UK, probably not to the same scale, of trust between some of the working class citizens, some of the citizens from ethnic minority backgrounds, and the police, and the French state and the authority. And so I think if we view that in the prism of immigration, it's entirely wrong. You speak to any French person, they'll tell you that that's entirely wrong. It's a result of a sort of breakdown of trust between the citizens and those who are supposed to govern them. And that's the result of what we're seeing today. It's not the first time we've seen this kind of sort of unrest in France.
But the unrest was on ethnic lines, wasn't it?
Well, no,
From Marseille all the way to Calais.
I think the unrest was on a mistrust between specifically the police and ethnic minority communities, but we have to remember they're French, and that's what this is where I think we disagree in terms of this national identity. For me, being British is as much about celebrating the fact that someone like me could come from Iran at the age of 5, move to London, be embraced by our community, be educated by this country, have universal healthcare by this country, and I can embrace my Britishness as much as someone who was born here. That's what British identity means to me. That's what British values mean to me. And so this idea that just because I was born somewhere else, I can't have that national identity is ludicrous, as much as it is in France. So I really reject this idea that national identity was being driven out of the UK as a result of the European Union or supranational institutions. That didn't happen with the invention of the UN. That didn't happen in the Middle East with the invention of the Arab League. It hasn't happened with the European Union. British identity was just as strong here when we were a member of the European Union as it was before. The reality is we can have a conversation about how democratic the EU is and what sovereignty should be handed over, but this idea that British sovereignty was and British identity was somehow at stake or under threat is nonsensical.
Well, British identity is being attacked, without doubt.
By who?
Well, there's a whole swathe. I mean, it's lazy politics to define it as the left. But, if we were
let's not do that.
Let's not do that. But if we were having a drink at the pub, we would say, it's a bunch of lefty, wokey, open border brigade who are trying to undermine British identity. I mean, let's take BLM, for example. Black Lives Matter. For me, that is the inculcation of division. It's the promotion of division. It's not diversity and inclusion. It is actually weaponizing ethnicity to create division and to promote one race, one ethnicity over the other.
That's such nonsense.
Really,
Black
but
Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter
no more than white lives.
No, but the whole point is that the Black lives are viewed as less than in the eyes of the media establishment and the political establishment. It came as a result of the fact that Black people specifically were disproportionately affected by state violence, by the police, and a plethora of policies that come from the state. And so it was said in the same way that women's rights movements, for example, with the suffragettes was said, in that their lives isn't seen as valued.
But the suffragettes never said that women were more valuable or important
Neither
than men.
did the Black Lives Matter movement.
But they did. It's Black Lives Matter. If you say all lives matter, they take exception to it.
But that's only the case if there's an equal sort of equilibrium across society. When Black lives are valued as less than by the police, for example, then the Black Lives Matter movement is a natural response to that.
Ali,
I'll give you an example, right? There's a plane. If you imagine a plane, I'm a big aviation fan, by the way.
Yeah.
A plane is flying steady, and it's headed straight, no problem. As soon as a plane tilts to the left, what the pilot is forced to do is, in essence, take their finger and push the right hand side of the plane down in order to level it. Black Lives Matter is the physical manifestation of that pilot's pushing the right hand side of the plane down, because we have a loss of equilibrium. There isn't an equality. There isn't a fairness in our society. And so what BLM does, and I'm less talking about a specific organization, but the movement that took such a hold amongst young people in this country, will say that the plane isn't level. The plane is tilted to one side, and so we're forced to push it down.
I think the analogy, even though it's a
it?
powerful analogy, but I don't think it's apt, because all lives matter, and you do not correct what you might regard as an equilibrium. But by the way, I think we are not an institutionally racist country, never been institutionally racist in my experience in the United Kingdom. I mean, you mentioned you moved here when you were 5, I moved here when I was 13. I am a product and a result of the absence of institutional racism in British institutions. I wouldn't be where I am.
That's a really terrible example. Whenever someone uses their own sort of, you might be an exception to the rule, or you might have broken through particular hardship, but to say I've made it and therefore institutional racism doesn't exist.
Well, I didn't say, well, my experience is that it doesn't exist.
But that's just your experience.
Yeah, but that's quite a powerful experience, because my own experience is my own experience.
But absolutely. But the whole point, the reason that BLM took such a storm in the country, and so many, particularly young people, felt so connected to it, was because that there are very different experiences.
Yeah, but when
than
I was
Europe.
brought up, and this goes back to the original bit of the debate about, what are British values? When I was brought up, I was repeatedly told, and by the way, my dad's a Muslim, I imagine you're of Muslim extract.
Yes.
In Islam, everyone is equal. There is no inequality. You cannot say one person is more important than another. And the Black Lives Matter movement undermined that very essential and I think very British value that we are all equal. Because I don't believe that police are racist. I don't believe our important judicial...
Well, then your quarrel is with all the independent reports that have been done that do show that the police are institutionally racist. It's not with me.
No,
the facts show that the police, at least the Metropolitan Police, are institutionally racist.
I just don't believe it. I haven't experienced anything like that in my life.
Okay, I've never personally seen Mars, but it exists.
No.
Right? So just because in my experience
so
I haven't seen it exists.
What I say, and what I believe happened in France is happening in France, is that there has been too much immigration, that there is too many divisions and too many cultural schisms, if you like, in society, and that as a people we're being forced to adopt other values without a homogeneity, without an evolution, and it's all been by design to undermine nation states. And I would say at the heart of the problem is Brussels. And
but what evidence do we have that what's happening in France has any link to immigration?
Well, it's you just said it yourself. You accepted that it was ethnic minorities across the country.
No, I'm saying they're disproportionately affected.
No, you said it was ethnic minorities kicking off against the police.
No, I didn't. I said that. I made a very strong case that it's French people, often in ethnic minority backgrounds, right, in ethnic minority communities, because they're disproportionately affected. But that and immigration are two different things. Because ethnic minority Britons, French people, are French citizens.
Of course, they're French citizens, but they...
So what's that got to do with immigration?
But
we don't know if they're first generation, second generation, third generation.
Yeah, but the ethnicity. The point I'm making is that the nature of the country is changing too fast. We're causing schisms in society. I think it's being generated deliberately by the EU. The EU wants in mass immigration. The EU wants to dumb down nation states. And this is the result of what you get when you do it. You lose national identity, you lose cohesion, and you end up in virtual anarchy. That's how I see France. I mean,
but there's just no evidence for that. There's no evidence.
But there is real evidence that France hasn't ever had hasn't had a Foreign Office travel guidance against it ever in my life. We had a Foreign Office guidance against traveling to France. It's like France is behaving like a third world country. That's what's happening in France at the moment, and it's not the white ethnicities that are rising up against the police. It's the ethnic minorities that are rising up against the police.
Look.
We've got to call a spade, Ali.
But you need to have some evidence for saying that.
It's all over the
dangerous.
It's all over the telly.
Dangerous to suggest that it's entirely ethnic minority communities. I've seen the images. I have friends in France. It is the communities as a whole. The reality is it's often working class communities, and working class communities often tend to be disproportionately, the poorer communities tend to be disproportionately of the ethnic minority backgrounds. And because it's a reaction to the violence and the killing of someone from an ethnic minority, then the result is naturally that those communities are going to feel the pain more. But to suggest just because we've switched on the TV and we've seen lots of black and brown faces that this is immigration, there's no evidence for that. I mean, what we're talking about here is a 17-year-old child was killed. As a result of a traffic stop, right? And it's not the first. And this deep mistrust between these communities and the police is a serious issue.
But the point I'm making is to use that
is born out of
too much immigration too fast.
No, but to use that as a Brexit immigration line or an anti-EU line is both dangerous and
I think it's the truth, Ali. That's what's happened.
I think it's opportunism. It's an opportunism. It's a chance to hit the EU, and that's not what's happening here.
That is precisely
These are French citizens who have felt the hard hand of the police, often in its violence, and that pain is being felt across France and has been for decades.
So I mean, let's take the EU then. Let's take the EU. The EU supports things like BLM. The EU supports things like reparations for British slavery in the 19th century. I mean, where, for example, are you on Winston Churchill?
As with all historical figures, they need to be looked at in a nuanced way, which I'm sure you wouldn't agree. I was a history student,
and
we
disagree.
look at everyone
but,
in the context of the time. But
St. Paul's cave, to the extent, by the way, if there's any racism in this country, I think the racism is
you can't deny that there's no racism
against white people. I think there's
Ben.
No,
come
on.
St.
Paul's Cathedral's website described Winston Churchill. This is how hijacked our institutions have become as a result of this kind of supranational movement towards the dumbing down of our national identity. They described our national hero, and I see Winston Churchill unashamedly as a national hero. They described him on their website as a white supremacist.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's an abomination to me. That is hollowing out what it means to be British.
I think we've become confused on national identity, because the reality is, I think, I don't agree that being a part of even a broader political union somehow erodes our national identity. And we're both two people who weren't born in the UK, who very much see ourselves as British and can see ourselves as more than one thing. And those things can be, I think, simultaneously held. I don't think British identity was under any real threat up until the sort of immigration idea was brought on. I've always been very proud to be British and understood what that meant as more than necessarily even a flag, even though I'm very proud, and I've played football with that flag on my shirt, for example. The reality is, I think it's been hijacked. I think it was hijacked for nefarious reasons. It was specifically in Brexit. I never saw any tension between being European, being British, and even being someone who was born in Tehran and is Muslim.
Ali, so many Remainers say, I identify as being European, not British.
Mm-hmm.
That is a declaration of the national identity becoming of subsidiary importance to this.
Well, I can't speak to individuals.
No, but that's what Ursula von der Leyen wants. That's what the Commission want. They want to dumb down national identity. Eventually, they want to become one European mega state.
I don't think that's true.
That is exactly.
And I don't think
they
that's
want
where we're
ever
going.
Closer union. That's where they're going.
Look, ever closer unions mean more political cooperation, and we must remember we've spoken about the Second World War.
It's not just political. People said 10 years ago they wouldn't have an army. Well, guess what? They've now got Frontex, and they've got permanent structured cooperation. They've got a complete military research facility. They want military interoperability. They want independent foreign policy. The EU wants to set European foreign policy. It doesn't want member states to do it. It's stripping power away. It's getting rid of nation states, and it's causing problems.
It's not getting rid of nation states, because each nation state has, and whether it's flawed or not, has the space to democratically engage with these processes. And it's the same way that, for example, someone in Cornwall can say our sort of sovereignty was taken to Westminster. The question is, how isolationist do you want to get? How much
Cornish second.
Yeah, but how much smaller do you want to get? The point was that the European Union was seen as a project to bring us economically closer together, politically closer together, as a result of what we saw was almost over decades of war on the continent. And
no. The EU was not a creation to prevent war. The EU started as a trade body.
It did, as a result, but it was created out of the context of the war. It was created out of the smoke of the war.
NATO keeps peace in Europe, not the EU. The EU, by the way, causes a lot of division. We nearly had civil strife and civil kicking off in Greece as a result of the euro, in 2012, 2013. Let's not forget that.
I've been to Athens and spoken to people there. Look, the reality is, I think it would be disingenuous to say that the war had no impact on the creation of the EU and that sort of closer political unions as a way to bring these nations closer together, to discourage at least war, and to create better economic environments and better political environments would be naive to say that that's not the case. But the fact is, all around the world, we're seeing regions come together for economic purposes, for political purposes, and this idea that the identity of the state is somehow eroded, I just don't subscribe to. I don't think, look at throughout, as the political union was brought close together, whether you look at it from the Eurozone all the way to all the treaties that we've been able to opt out of, the British identity was never under threat.
I think it's seriously under threat.
I just think we have different definitions of what a British identity is.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm very proud of the British Empire. I'm very proud of Winston Churchill. I'm very proud of the legacy that we've left across the world, our footprint, our law, our language. If that is attacked and we lose self-confidence in who we are and the great contributions we've made to the world, you've attacked the British identity.
The problem I have is, and the way that I view it, is that I actually think that this conversation around British identity has been hijacked by all the wrong people for nefarious reasons. When I came to this country at the age of 5, what I saw as British identity was a community that was willing to take me in, that was willing to educate me, that was willing to look after my healthcare, and was able to nurture me to the point where a boy who came as an immigrant was able to take on the Prime Minister, go toe-to-toe with the Prime Minister, could come closer than anyone has in 100 years to take on a Prime Minister. Yeah. That's what it means for me to be British. For that to then be hijacked by people who suggest that patriotism is taking all the power away and pulling us away from an economic union, pulling us away from a political union, and to suggest that being British has something to do with either your race or your community or all those sort of nefarious things.
Well, it's shared values. You have to
But those are the values.
Yeah.
But those are the values. It's stories like mine being a reality. But the minute that we start to talk about immigration, and this is where it's nefarious for me, I think politically, there's no question that the conversations around the European Union conveniently began around the times that economic strife began to hit the hardest. When people were struggling and the NHS waiting lists were hitting them hard, when jobs were hitting us hard, when wage stagnation was hitting us hard, what happened was these really bad faith political actors came and said, when you're sat in your waiting room at the NHS hospital, look to your right. There's an immigrant family going in before you. That can't be right, can it? Or when you go into a job interview and you see someone, a black or brown face going into interview and they get the job ahead of you, that can't be right, can it? And so they created this bogeyman that essentially became immigration, and they said, our national identity is being stripped away from us.
But that's not how
and
our institutions...
but those were lies.
Those
were lies. That wasn't what was happening. What was happening was the rich were becoming richer, and as tax cuts to the very richest were being given, our institutions and our public services were being starved of the finances they needed. In order to quell the unrest, they created a new boogeyman. What I want to say is that's not the boogeyman.
That is not
the
right.
boogeyman is the fact that the richest continue to take the wealth of the country and keep it in the top 1%, and the rest of us have to suffer. And then we're told that we have to blame the immigrant family next door when they're not to blame. They're suffering just as much as we are.
No one's saying blame
it's
the
the
immigrant
billionaires
family.
that are getting off scot-free. They're the real enemies that we should be looking at.
Every private company in this country now pretty much operates something called environmental social governance, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which requires you to adopt diversity and inclusion. We are all practicing a form of racism against white people in this country. That is what is happening.
Do you live in a different country than I do?
No.
This can only be the example there.
But I'm telling you, this is what's happening. This is what is happening right now.
Well, Ben, we clearly do disagree, and it sounds like we might live in two different countries and two different societies, but I think that's often the case with people's experiences. If everyone can like and subscribe and let us know in the comments what you think, and I would love to go check out and see what real people think. Not that me and you aren't real people. What real people think around the country.
It's been a pleasure meeting you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Maybe see you in Uxbridge and South Ruislip.
Yeah.